Hey, hello, welcome to the Normies. This is episode 3 of our podcast. Corey can't be here tonight, so it's going to be me, your host, Nate Wallace, here solo. Just want to get into kind of this NYC Freedom Rally from yesterday, and especially a speech from my friend and editor of the Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal, connecting the vaccine mandates here at home, the policies also in Canada of Justin Trudeau, and the correlation that's statistically borne out now with data between people that are in big time staunch support of lockdowns here at home, strict policies of firing workers, keeping and people like such as Kyrie Irving now is just a very visible example of the many others, the firefighters, the teachers, all the other sectors of workers in New York City that are out of a job because of their own medical decision with their body. And we know that I'm not going to get into like the vaccine necessarily. I mean, there's issues of it, there's aspects of it that people have issues with. There's haven't been an mRNA vaccine before. It's different than other vaccines, very different than the flu vaccine, which is inoculating you with a small dose of that virus. So I think it's really unfair to just paint everybody with a broad brush as right wingers, and that's sort of what we saw, like with the whole Canadian trucker protest. And we're seeing now that like the people that were the most enthusiastic supporters of like I said earlier, the lockdown policies, and also the irony of this are also the supporters of the permanent war state in the U.S., the super new red scare, McCarthyite hysteria, the censorship so many people have faced. And that needs to be called out, because these are the same people that I grew up thinking in the early 2000s were the ones that were, against censorship, were against, the calls to, do McCarthyite witch hunts against people because of their views. And now are essentially, if you're, basically toting the line of the State Department as it relates to what's going on in Ukraine and with Russia. So I'm going to go in here and show a little clip of a speech from Max Blumenthal yesterday at Union Square in New York City, and we'll go from there. And I'll actually follow that up with an article that's come out, that links the data I was talking about between the court showing the correlation in views between liberals essentially, and that don't want to hear anything about the effects of vaccine mandates. We're not even talking about the vaccine. We're talking about the mandates and the loss of jobs for people that do not comply. I mean, I have a problem with that. It's just it has nothing to do with. There's plenty of people who are vaccinated who have a problem with that, and myself included, for whatever that's worth. And even though I don't think it's necessary to qualify that with anything, because people have their own reasons. And at best, as we've talked about, when it's become clear, and even the CDC's acknowledged that in terms of stopping the spread, it's not really what they claim. They claim that it helps prevent severe illness and hospitalization. So the idea that somehow someone like Kyrie Irving is endangering people of being able to play home games at the Barclays Center in New York City is an absolute farce. And the idea that firefighters need to lose their jobs. The idea that teachers, a guy like I know, Garrett Ramirez, who we were hanging out with yesterday, who is out of a job now because of how he feels about this and his refusal to comply with a mandate. And that means losing your health insurance, it means losing your livelihood. So it's not just theoretical. So let's go ahead and get to the clip I want to share where Max kind of illustrates these connections, and we will go from there.
But as soon as our corporate feudal lords ran out of so I don't know if you noticed, but as soon as our corporate feudal lords ran out of variants to frighten us into submission, as soon as the Moderna stock started slipping on the Dow and the masks began to come off, they found a new war to keep the public in a state of mass formation psychosis and to continue the process of corporate looting. Last week, Congress stripped out billions and billions of dollars of funding for COVID in order to send $14 billion of weapons and aid to a country thousands of miles away fighting our designated enemy. And now in this war, they've gone from demonizing the unvaccinated to demanding that you hate all Russians. Yeah, we've got a new enemy. They're banning the concerts of Tchaikovsky. They want to get rid of Leo Tolstoy's books. And they're branding anyone who dissents from the war party as a traitor on daytime TV. And have you noticed that the people who say that they're the most tolerant, who say they're the most liberal and well-meaning, who are the most hateful and aggressive people under the COVIDian regime, have become the main constituency for World War III. We need to see this as the same war, and we need to send a message to the corporate war state. You don't get to say that you're spreading democracy and freedom when you seize people's bank accounts and declared emergency law and branded your own citizens as fascists. You don't get to send weapons to neo-Nazis integrated into the Ukrainian military when you demonize your own citizens as neo-Nazis for protesting you, Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, so there's a little, snippet of it right there, and I think it's a powerful, connection made, and something needs to be discussed. And I think what we're referring to here, and what I mentioned earlier, was this right here. And you look at this is from the Star Canadian paper, and it says poll from Canada shows those most compliant with the COVIDian biomedical regime are now the main constituency for World War III. Coverage of the poll is framed to portray those who resist corporate state propaganda as a threat to democracy. And if you zoom in here on the numbers a little bit, let me see if I can do that. It kind of lays it bare here. And I don't know if I can actually, it's not working too well with that, but I'll go ahead and just kind of read it out. This is looking for the question of imposing tougher sanctions on Russia. Respondents who said they received 3 or more shots, 86%. For respondents who said they were unvaccinated, 13%. Seizing the assets of Russian oligarchs associated with Putin, 85%, the same 13% from unvaccinated. Cutting off shipments to Russia, 81%, 3 or more shots, 21% unvaccinated. And then sending additional military equipment to Ukraine, 3 or more shots, 82%. Those who are unvaccinated, 18%. So we're seeing a correlation, and it's, to me, it's not so much about, like I said, the vaccine itself, but it's about what the people who complied with the mandate and sort of like the correlation it shows with also their opinions and how it matches up with their viewpoint on this new Cold War and the escalation of tensions with Russia, nuclear armed Russia, over, let's be real, a country that's, run by a president named Zelensky, who ran on a peace platform, and got the support of the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine, only to betray them and then pursue the interests of the West. This is a huge project of the U.S. national security state, and to use Ukraine as a launching pad to challenge Russia, to push back against Russia, to weaken Russia. And that's not really the agenda at all of what benefits American workers. And that's something that, people are really not allowed to say without immediately being branded a traitor, suspect. In the case of Caleb Boppin, having Russia's state-affiliated media put on your Twitter account. I think the same thing was applied to the late Ed Schultz, who was a former MSNBC commentator and then went on to RT, former college football play-by-play guy for North Dakota State. North Dakota is suddenly Russia's state-affiliated media posthumously. It's just on his personal Twitter account. I mean, this is the level of insanity we're living through right now. And the only questions that the Jen Psaki gets, the president gets from the sheep that serve in the Washington Press Corps are why we're not doing more, why we're not doing more to push harder, why we're not implementing the no-fly zone like Zelensky wants, which is the beginning of World War III, requiring that a Russian aircraft be shot down in order to enforce. So this is the world we're living in. And when it gets to the question of like the COVID stuff and the lockdowns and the damage that's done. I mean, I was, people came up and interviewed me yesterday as my experience as a teacher, in an urban city, literally across the Hudson River from New York City, and with very low income kids who are struggling and all sorts of issues, and the effects of lockdowns on them, and the learning deficits, the social emotional deficits from them in middle school now are very real, unbelievably devastating, quite frankly. The effects on mental health, and it's just sort of all dismissed as like collateral damage in the minds of people that buy into the narratives, pushed out by Fauci, pushed out by the sort of the COVIDian, state of emergency that kind of keeps us in a paralyzed state of emergency and feeling like if you do not simply just stay at home, you are killing people. Stay home, save lives. And as this thing went on, I'm not trying to minimize the suffering of anybody, but there's immense suffering that's been caused in the form of opioid overdoses, in the form of mental health crises with people that don't have access to those resources. I mean, there was a woman yesterday who came up to me named Amelia, and I wish I had her last name, from Jersey City, and was pointing out how she was out there because concern over the fact that mental health support groups have been essentially all remote for 2 years now. 2 years. That means anybody, whether it's someone needs to check into a drug treatment facility. All right. There's people that are, so much of like the whole process of recovery for people is based in the human interaction and the support you get from people, the human touch, even, right? When someone's struggling, giving a testimonial about something they're dealing with, and someone putting their hand on their shoulder or holding their hand, showing a sign of support. And that has been removed. And still in New Jersey to this day, those support groups are on Zoom, from what I understand, and that's just a huge problem. And we're moving more and more towards a society where we're more removed. We live more in the virtual space. Human interaction we do have is more just like, running into people here and there, quick interactions, and they're trying to normalize the and not just the surveillance state we have, but just the idea of like being a sort of a virtual being. And then there'll be a smaller class of people that actually do things physically, that make things go, that aren't really thought about in the minds of the policymakers that live inside the DC Blob and the sort of social elites and the financial elites that exist here, in New York City, and the same with like places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. So we see a massive divide. In Canada, you see it with like the metropolitan Toronto crowd and the suburbs there versus like more rural areas, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the just disconnect is real. And for us to just dismiss these schisms as being irrelevant because some people maybe have problematic politics, some people, there are some people with problematic politics that we might not agree on other issues, is a mistake. I mean, we cannot just live in our bubbles, man. I mean, and that is something that I've really learned these last 2 years, that the biggest mistake is people, clinging to sort of their little ideological group, and then trying to just, distance and shut down and silence people who aren't there, who aren't there, and maybe, say things that, may even admittedly be problematic. But at the end of the day, what this whole COVID experience has done the last 2 years, more than anything else, is show us how easily divided people can become, the hatred that people that can start to feel towards even their loved ones, the relationships ruined, the family relationships ruined, the fights people have had over these issues, when that is not something that is good for humanity. It's definitely not something good for the people in this country, and it's meant to distract us from what is actually happening in reality in countries like Ukraine. We never hear in our media or corporate media about the Azov Battalion, about Right Sector, about what really happened in Maidan in 2014, and the Victoria Nuland's role, the muscle that went in there was neo-Nazi, muscle to make sure that the former president Yanukovych was removed, who was duly elected. And yes, there were people in Western Ukraine that were very mad about him, reneging on a deal with with Europe and whatnot. And But the reality is that he was duly elected, and he wasn't even reneging. He was trying to put the pause button on it. And for some people to act as if that was not a coup, when it, as in by definition, was a coup, is problematic, and it's informing the insane sort of views we see now from the American public with regards to supporting these sanctions, in regards to policies that are going to cause immense human suffering. We have not even pointed out the irony that none of these people are talking about what's happening in the Yemen right now as bombs rain down on that country, because they're not the right victim. They don't look the right way. They're Shia Muslims, so they must be Iranian proxies. You always hear, if you hear about it at all, even, right? We don't know that there's still bombings in Syria. The Israelis go and bomb Syria. Who do we support more than any country in the world before in Israel? The dirty wars we've had in Syria. Now moving to Ukraine, and of course, the issue of Palestine that is persistent and needs to be persistent, because it's one of the most egregious and obvious human rights catastrophes in the world. But yet, the United States and our foreign policy, and under the a unipolar world run by the United States, the prospects for any kind of justice for Palestinians are essentially nil, to be honest. So we're in a state right now where our elites, our Washington blob, whether they be policymakers or the pundits who ask them to throw them the little softball questions up at their press conferences, are leading us down a dangerous road that is not beneficial to anyone except the people at the top of the food chain, especially in the Dulles Airport to Washington, D.C. corridor that's run by and powered by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, and go down the line. And who is getting all this money? They strip a COVID bill out that's got relief for all sorts of things and for helping people out, like even monoclonal antibody treatment. That's been proven to be 85% effective for people if they get treatment early on with COVID. That's gone. So many other sources of funding that would go to alleviate the suffering many have dealt with this last 2 years, whether from COVID or from the policies put in place to allegedly mitigate COVID. And that's going now for more weapons to a fight, to a war zone that is not going to ever result in a decisive Ukrainian victory over Russia. They know that. That's not the point, though. The point is to weaken Russia, to ramp things up, to essentially use Ukrainian bodies as fodder to keep this Cold War going and keep the tensions hot, and making money for Washington and crushing the Russian economy in an attempt to, let's not forget, go back to the 1990s, make Russia into a vassal state, essentially, where their public goods were all auctioned off when the Soviet Union collapsed. The oligarchs were created. You had people like Larry Summers go over there and take part in this mass privatization. I mean, you had more human death happen in the 1990s in Russia than in any country in peacetime in the modern world. And that's not talked about here either in this context. That's what gave rise to Vladimir Putin in the first place. But we can't talk about that, right? That's off limits. It's not what we're supposed to discuss. We're supposed to just sit here and just not think critically, profess this "we stand with Ukraine" narrative, no matter what. And Russia is this aggressor who, with no cause at all, not mentioning the 8 years of 14,000 deaths of people in Donbass province, fighting against an illegitimate coup government that in their dispossession, the fact that they were dealing with fascist forces that see them as subhuman, dealing with a country in Ukraine that bans socialist parties, that bans opposition, that and then has, you watch Morning Joe on MSNBC, you would think the Ukrainians were essentially the avatar of freedom. If you wanted to put a picture of freedom, democracy, and everything good and holy in the world in a Pictionary, you would put a picture of Zelensky next to a blue and yellow flag, according to our policy elites, the people such as David Ignatius, who I call the CIA whisperer with the Washington Post, the people such as, the Council on Foreign Relations guy right now, whose name is escaping me at the moment. I can't believe it, but Richard Haas, right, who's always on there as a guest. their whole position and the whole existence of that organization is to continue to promote American hegemony around the globe. It's not about bettering the lives of people in Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania, in the Rust Belt and other parts of this country that have been hollowed out by globalization policies, by exploitative jobs, right? That's not the agenda. We've seen the failure of the whole Bernie Sanders movement being sabotaged by the Democratic Party, but then also the way in which someone like Bernie Sanders himself could just be kneecapped and turned into a pawn of that establishment in the name of terror over Trump. The idea that we gotta vote for Biden to stop fascism. And like, look, Trump is not no friend of mine, but his Biden presidency right now is an absolute disaster. It's going off the rails, and we are being led into World War III. We're not being told the truth in any way. We're still being divided. We literally just the insanity of what's happening. There is a basketball player who is one of the best basketball players in the world. And I'm not trying to elevate the level of sports beyond issues of war and peace and what's happening, over in Ukraine right now and what's happening in Yemen and those people who are suffering daily, or the people of Venezuela who are still suffering under the boot of U.S. sanctions. And has the U.S. laughably declared that some guy named Juan Guaido is the president of their country, I guess, officiating a fake government, right? So we're living in an empire of lies. We're living in a time where up's right, what's right is left and what's up is down. And it's exhausting, quite frankly. It's absolutely exhausting. And it's just key that people sit back and reflect a little bit on like what's making them so mad, why people are angry all the time at each other, why we can't seem to, kind of put our finger on what exactly is going on. And honestly, a lot of it is meant to make you feel like you're going crazy. The way the media is projected out, the way the narratives are pushed out. So I just think people need to take a step back, trust their instincts, be skeptical of power. And the thing that was the most devastating of the last 2 years about this whole experience of the pandemic, unlike what people thought early on the left, that this was going to lead to a general strike that was going to weaken capitalism, right? And it was going to lead to a system that where, a real kind of like progressive change should happen, because it was essentially workers were going to stay home, right? And that was going to put strain on the system. No, it just led to hyper exploitation. It led to us moving the agenda of tech oligarchs ahead. And when you look at the book written by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, called The Great Reset, that stuff is like, it's on its way. That's not a conspiracy theory. Sure, it's a conspiracy of global elites, or billionaire elites around the world, but it's laid out there for you in plain English, in plain, and sure it's translated in other languages too, that they are trying to change fundamentally the way we live. You will own nothing and you will be happy. And it poisons everything, because we can't even discuss climate change without also discussing the way in which billionaire elites are going to try to exploit climate change to essentially lower the standard of living for everybody else around the world, and under the name of saving the planet, while allowing a global oligarchy and a set of people that might not be in the 1% but are up in that ballpark, right, to live the lives they live unchallenged, to not have any sort of restructuring of society, and to have income and wealth inequality just proliferate unabated. So that's where we are right now. I want to share maybe a few other things, a few other clips from here, because there was some good stuff shared at this rally yesterday. This guy, his name, let me make sure I say it right. I think it is Tremel Thompson, who is a Metro Transit Authority conductor in New York City, who's been doing a lot of these, protests out there at Barclays Center about taking on the mandates, challenging the ban on Kyrie playing at home, even though he can sit courtside at a game. And just the reason I bring up Kyrie is because Kyrie Irving, that is, is what's happening to him is a window to what's happening to all these workers around New York City that have lost their jobs. And whether you agree with them or not about their refusal to get vaccinated, that shouldn't be the issue. We're talking about people losing their health insurance, losing their ability to pay rent, pay a mortgage, having their lives destroyed. And Kyrie has the financial wherewithal to be able to do this, not for selfish reasons, because he's putting himself above the team, but because he wants to show the unjust nature of the policies that are in place by Mayor Eric Adams now, who did inherit them from Bill de Blasio, but is refusing to retract them. And I have my own theories on why that is, kind of like whether he really cares about it so much or if he's being pressured, whether it be by pharmaceutical aligned health authorities, big pharma aligned health authorities, people, interest groups. Because it's amazing when you look at it. Aaron Judge, the New York Yankees, baseball's right around the corner, is unvaccinated, might not be able to play Yankee Stadium, reportedly. And this just gets at it's achieving no public health utility, no purpose at all, other than to maintain a culture war that distracts us from talking about why our country cannot provide health care to millions upon millions upon millions of Americans every single year, constantly. And why we have a corporate healthcare state of for-profit private health insurance that decides whether you get treatment or whether you don't. We do have rationing, right? We have all sorts of artificial scarcity that is not really based on a real kind of scarcity, but is based on a hoarding of resources by the ultra wealthy and the oligarch class of this country. We hear so much about Russian oligarchs. How little do we hear about our own American oligarchs and the reality of the influence they use to get the policy they want passed through Washington, D.C. And it's funny, on the question of Russian oligarchs, there's very little talk about Ukrainian oligarchs and the corruption in that country, and the complete marginalization of Russian-speaking people, the fascist ideology of Stefan Bandera, the taking down of statues to World War II heroes that fought and liberated the country from the Nazis. That context is being erased, and they're putting up names of actual fascist collaborators, people who killed tens of thousands of Polish people, of Jewish people, and that is being erased. That can't be discussed either, because of course, if you bring any of this up, if you discuss any of the things I'm talking about, you're by default a Russian agent. Whether you're wittingly or unwittingly doing the bidding of Putin, you are a Putin puppet in the eyes of our mainstream media. It's that simple. There's no space for debate. There's no space for dissent at all in this state we're living in now. And the way the media covers it is meant to make it seem so abhorrent that anybody could possibly challenge their narrative, as to associate you with the worst type of people in human history. I mean, you've seen the analogies of Putin to Hitler and stuff now, and that's their new favorite. They do this oftentimes when it comes to war. They did it with Saddam Hussein even. So we're dealing with a level of gaslighting that's unprecedented now, because the way the media landscape has changed since the whole Iraq war invasion and the catastrophe that was that. And now we're seeing it with all the tools of social media, with the alliance of government and big tech to censor voices they do not want people to hear in the name of suppressing misinformation. And we are truly living in a dystopian novel right now. So I don't say any of that to make people despair, but to make people want to be inspired to take action and to lose their fear over, what these people say about them. Because honestly, you have to know who you are as a person and be willing to speak truth to power. Sitting here criticizing Russia endlessly, we're not Russian citizens. We have no ability to influence their government, but we have a huge ability to influence what our government's doing. And the fact that we are promoting war and we are not promoting peace anywhere in this world. It's all about promoting U.S. militarism abroad and using the military to protect the interests of American multinational corporations and their interests and trading partners abroad. I mean, that is what it is. So does that make you anti-American? You hate your country? I don't think so. I think it means that you realize that the government that represents us is rotten and is causing immense pain and suffering all over this world to maintain a decadent standard of living for a small few. And that's not the masses of the American people. right? So it's important that we make those distinctions. So let me go ahead and share what Tremel Thompson had to say here, just a minute or so. And I'm going to wrap it up here shortly because don't have my co-host on here today and got to run and do a couple other things too tonight. But, you know, hopefully some people get to check this out. You can go check out, you know, I might share out the rest of Max's speech. I shared kind of like the money clip there at the beginning, but there's some really, really good stuff in there. But here's what Tremel said, partially at least in his introduction. Tremel Thompson, who works as a subway conductor in New York City. And go ahead and listen to this and hear what y'all think from the backside.
Due to COVID, and they didn't mandate us because that let me know it's about economics. It's not about our safety. It's not about choice. This was an economic war on all New York City residents. If you was able to have your own job, this would not affect you. But we government employees, we civil servants, they treat us like we servants. I hate that word. I hate that servant word. But we got to do better because it's not over. This is not the time for us to get comfortable. This is not the time for us to go to sleep. This is not the time to say, hey, that's them over there, because it could be me today and you tomorrow. And when we talk about unionism, this is how we view unionism. An injury to one is an injury to all. And that's how we have to look at it. That's how we have to look at it. We are not in this fight by ourselves. This fight brought many colors together, many religions together, many everything together. Kids, grown-ups. We traveling around the country, fighting for the people who don't want to fight for themselves. That's what this is all about. So look, I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm actually going to introduce the next guest. He is the editor of the Great.
So I didn't get, I'll let him do the little introduction here. And I guess here at the beginning of Max's speech, I was trying to play an earlier clip actually, but I'll let this keep rolling here for a second.
Gray Zone, probably the #1 independent journalist in the country. Yeah, I said it. I said it. Probably got close to 500,000 followers on all his social media platforms. I'm bringing up my brother, Max Blumenthal. Make some noise, New York.
Humble. Yeah, I cannot support that message that I'm #1. There's a lot of good people out here, and it's a real honor to be here with the OGs like Tremel, like Joe Rose, all of you who were here from day one, because honestly, I wasn't here from day one. You all deserve so much credit for starting this just on a corner with a bullhorn, bringing this movement together. This has become a global movement, and so it's just an honor to be here. This is my first NYC Freedom Rally. Yeah, give yourselves a hand. Give yourselves a hand because you have seen through the lies, the gaslighting, the false equivalencies, the propaganda. They tried to pit your families against you. They tried to turn your friends against you. They tried to fire you, and you are still here. You are still standing. You held the line. Give yourselves a hand. That's right. Now, I see this from the perspective of someone who's been in the anti-war movement, organizing against imperialism for years. I see this as a new war on the people. I come from the left, but I don't see this as a left-right issue. They try to say this is all a bunch of right-wingers. I don't see it that way. And when I talk to y'all, I see a diversity of views. What this is about is decent working people trying to hold on to their humanity, their basic rights, their bodily autonomy, and their very sanity in the face of a cold, soulless corporate war state that seeks to reduce every individual to a QR code. That's what this is about. That's why people have been protesting this from Beirut to Berlin to Boston to Bolivia. It's not a left-right issue. This is about rights. This is about basic rights as a citizen and the bodily autonomy that is at the foundation of your individual integrity, and that's what we're fighting for. Now that they say the mandates are going away, we're in a new war. The wars won't go away. The emergency state won't go away. We need to remember that 2 years ago, almost to this day, the corporate state that controls our country declared a state of emergency. and launched a corporate coup that was a war on the people, every one of you, for profits. And so while St. Fauci told us that we had 2 weeks to flatten the curve, Big Pharma, BlackRock, and Scrooge McDuck big tech billionaires like Bill Gates, the vaccine investors put the FDA and the CDC in their back pocket and turned every member of Congress into a sales rep so they could rack up record profits for Pfizer and Moderna that saw these companies make combined profits of $65,000 per minute. Per minute. And what happened to us? What happened to working class Americans? Suffered the sharpest increase in poverty in 50 years. No, it was a controlled demolition. When the lockdowns began, the wealth of the global 99% declined precipitously, while the world's 10 richest men doubled their fortunes. By design, because they were in big tech. And now they say it's over, but they won't lift the state of emergency. So I don't know if you noticed, but as soon as our corporate feudal lords ran out of variants to frighten us into submission, as soon as the Moderna stock started slipping on the Dow, and the masks began to come off, they found a new war to keep the public in a state of mass formation psychosis and to continue the process of corporate looting. Last week, Congress stripped out billions and billions of dollars of funding for COVID in order to send $14 billion of weapons and aid to a country thousands of miles away fighting our designated enemy, Ukraine. That means no more funding from federal funding for monoclonal antibodies that were deemed 85% effective. Why? Because the cast of sociopathic hovercraft elites that control our corporate state, for them, it's more profitable to kill Russian soldiers than it is to save American lives at this point. During the last war, the corporate state locked down millions of healthy people at home, driving them into poverty, depriving them of work, and forcing them to rely on the tech services that made record profits for our feudal overlords in Silicon Valley. In this war, the corporate state that controls this country is imposing sanctions on the designated enemy in Moscow, causing shortages of grain for the world, fertilizer for food, and record gas prices, making all of us poorer all over again, while the global 1% that gathers each year in Davos makes all.
I'm going to pause it real quick. I'm going to share something else real quick that I think is important. They're talking about prices right there. And what does the New York Times come out with today? This. Let me see if I got the right one. Ukraine war threatens to cause a global food crisis. And I will run through this a little bit. This is by Jack Nikas, just came out today. The war in Ukraine has delivered a shock to global energy markets. Now the planet is facing a deeper crisis, a shortage of food. A crucial portion of the world's wheat, corn, and barley is trapped in Russia and Ukraine because of the war, while an even larger portion of the world's fertilizers is stuck in Russia and Belarus. Sidebar, you got to love sanctions here, right? Really punishing Putin, right? It's all just about sticking it to them. And, it's not going to hurt, people all around the world, right? It's not going to cause hunger. It's just going to stick it to those bad guys. And, that's it. That's the official narrative. So, all right, back on script here to the story. The result is that global food and fertilizer prices are soaring. Since the invasion last month, wheat prices have increased by 21%, barley by 33%, and some fertilizers by 40%. The upheaval is compounded by major challenges that were already increasing prices and squeezing supplies, including the pandemic, shipping constraints, high energy costs, and recent droughts, floods, and fires. Now economists, aid organizations, and government officials are warning of the repercussions and increase in world hunger. You think that bothers Victoria Nuland or Robert Kagan or Bill Kristol or Richard Haas or David Ignatius or Joe Scarborough, who sits there every day acting like he's a, Volodymyr Zelensky fanboy who would do anything to be, I'll just stop right there. But no, it doesn't. That doesn't fit their narrative. This is all because of Putin. And all the problems of the world, we can just sit there and use Putin as a repository to place our anger into. Because it's not about our oligarchs. It's not about the oligarchs in Western Europe. It's not about the people that meet at Davos every year, the World Economic Forum, and global oligarchy that is just ruining people's lives and causing suffering all around. No, that's not the problem. It's simply this one bad guy in Russia who is launching an offensive invasion, and that needs all of our focus. Nothing structural is wrong. So, anyways, here we go. Back to the article. The looming disaster is laying bare the consequences of a major war in the modern era of globalization. Prices for food, fertilizer, oil, gas, and even metals like aluminum, nickel, and palladium are all rising fast, and experts expect worse as the effects cascade. Ukraine has only compounded a catastrophe on top of the catastrophe, said David N. Beasley, the director of the World Food Program, the United Nations agency that feeds 125 million people a day. There is no precedent even close to this since World War II. Well, don't worry, Mr. Beasley. Looks like World War III is on the horizon thanks to the actions and policies of our, American oligarchy here. Anyways, Ukrainian farms are about to miss critical planting and harvesting seasons. European fertilizer plants are significantly cutting production because of high energy prices. Farmers from Brazil to Texas are cutting back on fertilizer, threatening the size of the next harvest. China, facing its worst wheat crop in decades after severe flooding, is planning to buy much more of the world's dwindling supply. And India, which ordinarily exports a small amount of wheat, has already seen farm demand more than triple compared with last year. This has some sort of tinge of like nationalism there, that like this is part of the rise of China and, our power as a hegemon slipping away. It's a little bit of the New York Times, that's the voice slipping through right there. Around the world, the result will be even higher grocery bills. Isn't that great? Thank you, President Biden. We love sanctions. You are standing up for human rights. You care so much for human beings that you put in place Plan Colombia as vice president. You helped oversee the coup in Honduras that brought in Juan Orlando Hernandez. And you want to preach to us about human rights and tell us about who the good people are. And basically that if you critique any of the policies you're pushing forward with, then you somehow just support human suffering and people dying in a war zone. A war zone we are flooding with weapons, by the way, to make sure that it continues and turns into a insurgency that basically just throws Ukrainian bodies out there to die, knowing full well that there is not going to be a resolution to this that results in this Ukrainian government winning and Russia retreating in defeat. It's just not going to happen. So what are we doing? So anyways, the higher grocery bills. In February, U.S. grocery prices were already up 8.6% over a year prior, the largest increase in 40 years. All right, economists expect the war to further inflate those prices. For those living on the brink of food insecurity, the latest surge in prices could push many over the edge. After remaining mostly flat for 5 years, hunger rose by 18% during the pandemic to between 720 million and 811 million people. Earlier this month, the UN said that the war's impact on the global food market alone could cause an additional 7.6 million to 13.1 million people to go hungry. The World Food Program's costs have already increased by 71 million a month, enough to cut daily rations for 3.8 million people. We'll be taking food from the hungry to give to the starving, Mr. Beasley said. Rising prices and hunger also present a potential new dimension to the world's view of the war. Could they further fuel anger at Russia and calls for intervention? Or would frustration be targeted at the Western sanctions that are helping to trap food and fertilizer? Ding, 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 ding. There's your answer. And that's the answer that you should have. Because that's actually the cause. While virtually every country will face higher prices, some places could struggle to find enough food at all. Armenia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Eritrea have imported virtually all of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine and must find new sources. I want to stop for a second, too. This whole conflict between Russia and Ukraine was totally preventable if the U.S. would not have just consistently gone in there along with NATO and tried to push this asinine idea of having a country on Russia's border that we in the U.S. would find intolerable, joining a hostile military alliance. It'd be like if Canada or Mexico has missiles pointed at us, or has military bases representing countries in alliance with countries that we deem to be state enemies. We would no more tolerate that for 5 seconds. But yet we're sitting here preaching about the need to crash the global economy in ways that are going to affect the most vulnerable people and doing so with sanctions so we can punish Putin in a war that only happened because the NATO thing was not taken off the table. Even though we said they're not going to join NATO, but we said we won't agree that they shouldn't have the right to join NATO. So what are we talking about here? All of this suffering over essentially semantics. And that's fine with our global oligarchs. That's fine for the arms manufacturers that are raking in profits right now. Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. But anyways, let's keep going. But they are competing against much larger buyers, including Turkey, Egypt, Bangladesh, and Iran. Let's go back here. Yeah, which have obtained more than 60% of their wheat from the two warring countries. All right. And all of them will be bidding on an even smaller supply because China, the world's biggest producer and consumer of wheat, is expected to buy much more than usual on world markets this year because of the flooding we mentioned earlier. On March 5, China revealed that severe flooding last year had delayed the planting of a third of the country's wheat crop, and now the upcoming harvest looks bleak. This year's seeding situation could be said to be the worst in history, said China's agricultural minister, Tang Rizhang. I apologize for my mispronunciation. Rising food prices have been a catalyst for social and political upheavals in poor African and Arab countries, and many subsidized staples like bread in efforts to avoid such problems. But their economies and budgets, already strained by the pandemic and high energy costs, are now at risk of buckling under the cost of food, economists said. Tunisia struggled to pay for some food imports before the war and is now trying to prevent an economic collapse. Inflation has already set off protests in Morocco and is helping stir renewed unrest and violent crackdowns in Sudan. A lot of people think that this is just going to mean that their bagels are going to become more expensive. And that's absolutely true. But that's not what this is about, said Ben Isaacson, a longtime agricultural analyst with Scotiabank. Since the 1970s, North Africa and the Middle East have grappled with repeated uprisings. What actually led to people going into the streets and protesting, he said? It starts from food shortages and from food price inflation. Countries afflicted by protracted conflict include Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, are already facing severe hunger emergencies that experts fear could quickly worsen. In Afghanistan, I love how they always just slide in. They do that. New York Times loves this more than anything. That experts fear. That little phrase. I love that. Even though in this context, I mean, I get it, but they'll use that to push all sorts of nonsense out of the national security state, the war state here in the U.S. We, by the way, should rename the Department of Defense the Department of War. That's what it was called up until after World War II, when they thought, oh, wow, if we don't call it the Department of Defense, people might think we're actually trying to launch wars instead of just defend the American homeland. Well, you know, the earlier version was a little more truthful. In Afghanistan, aid workers warn that the humanitarian crisis has already been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, making it more difficult to feed the roughly 23 million Afghans, more than half the population, who do not have enough to eat. Nuruddin Zakar Ahmadi, the director of Bashir Navid Complex, an Afghan imports company, said the prices were rising across the board. It took him 5 days in Russia this month to find cooking oil. He bought 15-liter cartons for $30 each and will sell them at the Afghan market for $35 each. Before the war, he sold them for $23. The United States thinks it has, and that's not a big profit margin in terms of the business world. I mean, buying them for 30 a piece and selling them 35. So, you know, compared to what our companies do and the profit margins, you know, they mark stuff up at, that's not that high of a margin. The United States thinks it has only sanctioned Russia and its banks, he said, but the United States has sanctioned the whole world. For the global food market, there are a few worse countries to be in conflict than Russia and Ukraine. Over the past 5 years, they have together accounted for nearly 30% of the exports of the world's wheat, 17% of corn, 32% of barley, a crucial source of animal feed, and 75% of sunflower seed oil, an important cooking oil in some parts of the world. Russia has largely been unable to export food because of sanctions that have effectively cut it off financially. Ukraine, meanwhile, has been cut off physically. Russia has blocked the Black Sea for exports, and Ukraine lacks enough rail cars to transport food over land. What is now becoming more worrisome is the next harvest, particularly in Ukraine. On March 11, Ukraine's agricultural minister begged allies for 1,900 rail cars of fuel, saying that the country's farms had run out after supplies were diverted to the military. Without that fuel, he said, Ukrainian farmers would be unable to plant or harvest. There are other hurdles. The UN estimated that up to 30% of Ukrainian farmland could become a war zone. And with millions of Ukrainians fleeing the country or joining the front lines, far fewer can work the fields. Russian and Ukrainian wheat is not easily replaced. Inventories are already tight in the US and Canada, according to the UN, while Argentina is limiting exports and Australia is already at full shipping capacity. Over the past year, wheat prices are up 69%. Among other major food exports of Russia and Ukraine, corn prices are up 36% and barley 82%. The war also threatens another long-term shock to the food markets, a shortage of fertilizer. Matt Hugh from a farmer near Corpus Christi, Texas, said that skyrocketing prices had already forced him to stop applying fertilizer to the grazing fields that nourish his hundreds of cows, assuring that they will be skinnier come slaughter. Now he is worried he will have to also reduce fertilizer for his next corn crop, which would slash its yield. We've gotten into uncharted territory, he said. Russia is the world's largest fertilizer exporter, providing about 15% of the world's supply. This month, just as farmers around the world prepared for planting, Russia told its fertilizer producers to halt exports. Sanctions already were making such transactions difficult. Sanctions also have hit Russia's closest ally, Belarus, a leading producer of potash-based fertilizer, crucial for many major crops, including soybeans and corn. But even before the Ukraine war, Belarus's fertilizer exports were blocked because of sanctions over its seizure of an expatriate dissident who had been a passenger in a Ryanair jetliner forced to land in the country. In another ominous signal to fertilizer customers, earlier this month, European fertilizer producers said they were slowing or halting production because of soaring energy prices. Many fertilizers are made with natural gas. The world's major fertilizers have now more than doubled or tripled in price over the past year. Brazil, the world's largest producer of soybeans, purchases nearly half its potash fertilizer from Russia and Belarus. It now has just 3 months of stockpiles left. The National Soybean Farmers Association has instructed members to use less fertilizer, if any, this season. Brazil's soybean crop, already diminished by a severe drought, is now likely to be even smaller. They're preventing fertilizers from getting to producing countries, says Antonio Galvin, the Soybean Association's president, criticizing international sanctions. How many millions are going to starve to death because of the lack of these fertilizers? Brazil sells most of its soybeans to China. And to answer that question, Larry Summers says, we have to be willing to sacrifice, right? As if he's going to be the one bearing the brunt of this. As if, Bill Kristol or the neocons that get us into these disasters are going to ever bear the brunt of their horrible brinksmanship and their idea that we just have to be tough and set these red lines and, get us to the brink of war and ramp up tensions and then sit back and say that anybody complaining is just mad that they got to pay a little more for gas or their bagel costs a little more. Not that people are going to die because they literally can't eat. And people who are already hungry are not going to be losing their food to people who are starving, according to the UN, Mr. Beasley. Just unbelievable. Brazil sells most of its soybeans to China, which uses much of the crop to feed livestock. Fewer, more expensive soybeans could force ranchers to cut back on such animal feed, meaning smaller cows, pigs, and chicken, and higher prices for meat. John Bakehouse, a corn and soybean farmer in Hastings, Iowa, said he prepaid for fertilizer late last year because he worried about a looming food shortage. His fertilizer still has not arrived and now has less than a month to apply it to his corn crop. Without it, he said, his yields would be halved. 50% reduction there. When they show the cars jumping in slow motion and the passengers are up in the air, that's what it feels like, he said. We're all just kind of suspended in the air, waiting for the car to land. Who knows if it's going to be a nice, gentle landing, or if it's going to be a nosedive into the ditch. And I'll stop sharing at that point. I just think that Yeah, the media is frothing over this Ukraine war shit. Absolutely. I mean, it's really beyond belief. And the level of gaslighting that's going on, the level of making people sit there and question their own sanity, the families that are being like broken apart with debates over the dinner table, or just like, disagreements, people that actually see what we're talking about what's happening and what our, Washington foreign policy blob is doing as it relates to the Ukraine, and not just the half truths and the outright lies they're telling, the whitewashing of the Azov Battalion. CNN is just straight up using Azov Battalion footage with no context as just like, independent Ukrainian media. So there we are. I mean, it's all laid bare. I kind of just wanted to just lay that out, because I think that last New York Times article, the fact that that's in the New York Times, that's being acknowledged, but yet that's just collateral damage. All these people suffering, all that hunger, all that devastation, but we have to be willing to bear that price, right? So we can be good people. So we can virtue signal to the world that we're not going to stand with that autocrat Putin and his, rogue state that has to be defeated, even if it's at the cost of the world and millions upon millions, or even hundreds of millions, hundreds of millions, not even in the billions, suffering economically, but in terms of just raw nutrition and being able to, these are the kind of policies put in place, policy decisions that are choices, and the kind of blood that's on, President Biden's hands now in the name of, quote, standing up for human rights, defending our institutions, the rules-based international order, whatever you want to call it, is killing people, and people need to wake up. So on that note, I appreciate people that checking this out. We'll try to, put out some clips, and hope you were able to, hear what Max had to say at the rally, hear what Tramel Thompson had to say about his experience as a New York City subway conductor, and also just this discussion here about Ukraine, about Russia, about sanctions, and about what's going on just on a global level, and why people in the States really need to wake up, and in the Western world to really what's happening, and what are the kind of dark road our leadership is leading us down. So on that note, appreciate you tuning in to episode 3 of the New Normies podcast on the Redspin Sports Network, and I am out. Peace.